You're okay. Senator Higgins.
So, first of all, I want to acknowledge, and don't worry, I will be speaking to the section, but I want to acknowledge that there have been attempts and there has been moving forward in certain areas and aspects of this bill that we'll come to later. I think the removal of the undertaking is important and should be acknowledged, and I know was difficult and hard won. And I know that there are also attempts to make the process more functional in its sense, but there are still principles and points of principle and division. And I actually think when we look to information and tracing that some of the points raised by Senator Bacic could, I believe, potentially be compatible with the requirements I know the Minister is trying to meet and the principles and objections. So I know that the Minister, in some of the things, we'll come to them later, but is talking about an attempt to minimise and streamline this process in relation to what might be construed privacy, recognising that privacy, the private life of a birth parent, may be for or against wishing for contact, that there's not an assumption that should be made there, and so forth. But that there is a time limit, as I understand it, in the process, when we'll address it later, of 6 months, as being regarded as a reasonable period of time in which an opportunity has been given for those who may have very particular circumstances and others that they wish to make the case to the adoption authority in that regard. A general advertising scheme, such as potentially due to be put forward by Senator Bacic, may potentially be able to meet that collective requirement of a period of notice, because, as we know in the law, in the bill, future adoptions are under a whole different set of criteria. There's an assumption of access built in. So we are only dealing with a set group of historic access, and it may be that a generalised advertising scheme in which people who wish to and choose to can self-identify and then seek out a process of whatever kind in terms of indicating their rights, rather than an ongoing process which for the next time and added in memoriam, any adopted person who seeks their information, it triggers a set of specific queries in relation to their birth mother and birth father. That would also address the concern that many adopted people have raised with me, especially over the last day or two, which is that they don't necessarily always want the fact that they've looked for their birth information, that information to go to a birth mother or a birth father. They may not wish to know them to know they're in the country. They may, who knows what they... So it would address those individual privacy issues by providing an adequate collective solution, which, so I just would urge to potentially look to something of this generalised potential scheme. Again, obviously Senator Bacic was not able to put it forward without sight of the government amendments, but I think that it may address the process or the kinds of process that you're putting forward and could be worth considering in that regard. I think it could actually take us leaps and bounds forwards. If, having a set period of process undergone, we then move to a position where, following that process, unless there are particular objections that have been raised, it's generally assumed that people will be accessing their information in a more natural way at the time they choose. And again, of course, bearing in mind that sometimes when people seek this information, it's for very specific and time-sensitive reasons that they may be seeking out a birth certificate or health information and so forth. So again, I think that there's a potential solution in that. The potential other benefit of it, I rarely talk about resources in this regard, except when I'm talking about getting rid of tax reliefs, but in terms of resources, because rights must take precedent in relation to concerns on resources. Nonetheless, an approach such as that has been set out by Senator Bacic would free up resources for those who are using that second half of the bill, which is around tracing, where you do have birth parents and adoptees who are seeking each other. It would allow for a heavier allocation of resources to ensure a timely support for all of those situations in which you do have two parties who are both, or maybe more than two parties, who are actively seeking each other out. So again, I would just urge Minister to, and again, this is maybe the advantage of the debate finishing at 6, to look to and maybe test and seek advice on the potential of a collective time-bound solution. And that relates to section 2, part 2 of subsection 2 of section 1, around the timelining of it. So again, it may be that certain things would be put in place, a certain section of the bill may be commenced before the other section to facilitate the other sections coming into effect. it may affect a little bit of the timing. We might need to bake that into the bill as such. And the other general issue, of course, and I know that you, Minister, are very keen for this to move forward, but in a situation whereby another minister were to inherit this bill after its passing, I think perhaps a question might be under Section 1 if we do want to build in time caveats. What we don't want is that this bill moves through its process, it gets, I hope, substantially improved to better reflect the concerns that you're hearing today, and that then it sits on a shelf and doesn't move forward. So again, maybe that's just some thoughts in relation to Section 1, and I do think, Minister, there is scope here to fulfil what I know you're trying to fulfil, and to also crucially get to that one point, and this is the one that comes in more than anything else. We come into it later in definitions of personal and early. The birth certificate specifically. If the birth certificate, even if the advertising campaign related to birth certificates will be available and so forth, you know what I mean? But you know, that would be something that could, if that one particular crucial document became immediately available or had a collective consultation. Thank you, Minister.